We're going to have a reception later on, and it's going to give us a wonderful opportunity to all catch up with our friends and colleagues. But let me welcome you to Rutgers Law School. Bienvenidos to Rutgers Law School. It's wonderful to have you all here for this incredibly special event, an incredibly special memorial. My name is David Lopez. I am the co-dean of Rutgers Law School, Newark. I am also, and I will hand out some cards, the Professor Alfred Slocum Scholar. And so when I was selected for this position, thank you. I was asked about naming my appointment, and I gave it some thought, and I talked to some people on the faculty, and after very little deliberation, I realized that one of the themes that I wanted to send to the law school, one of the messages that I wanted to send through my appointment, is that we would continue to build upon the legacy of Professor L. Slocum and his long-term commitment to this institution, to public institution, to inclusiveness, to social justice, to opportunity. And there's certainly, it's certainly important for me as the dean here to recognize the tremendous work that many people in this room have done before me in terms of opening up the pathways, not only for me as the dean, but for our faculty members, and most importantly, our many students who are here today. Rutgers Law School, Newark, the People's Electric Law School, lives. The spirit of L. Slocum lives, and is particularly important at this particular moment in history when the rule of law is under attack, when basic notions and basic norms of social justice are under attack, when there's an incredible uncertainty out there in the wind about the divisiveness in this country. It's important at this time to remind ourselves of the legacy of L. Slocum and his commitment to inclusion and his understanding that we didn't have any talent to waste. We didn't have any talent to waste, and it was important to always cultivate the greatest real opportunity for all of us, all of our students, regardless of background. I know that some of you have heard me tell the story of why I decided to come here, and you've heard my very corny but very apt West Side Story analogy, right? I am a career civil rights lawyer. I worked in the Obama administration in charge of the litigation program for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission nationwide. It was an honor to serve with President Obama. I am what they call a non-traditional dean. I am a non-academic, a lawyer, a litigator, a social justice litigator for my entire career. And I wasn't particularly looking to do something else, but when this opportunity presented itself to me, it was like West Side Story. It was like that scene when Maria sees Tony from across the dance hall and their eyes meet and everything else is cut out. When I learned about the vision of Chancellor Cantor, when I learned about the legacy of not only Professor Slocum, but Arthur Kenoy, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Paul Trachtenberg, and many, many others at the school, and when I met the students and the alumni, I knew this was an incredibly special place, and I wanted to be part of it. Part of it to build upon the history, to build upon the legacy at this very critical, important moment in time. I am going to limit my remarks to those. I really look forward to hearing from all of the speakers and everybody else who wants to pay tribute to Professor Slocum. But before I start to introduce our speakers for the evening, I would like to give a shout out. My wife always says, don't say shout out. But I'd like to recognize certain important people who are here. My co-dean in Camden, Rutgers Camden, Kim Mutcherson. Who's Kim? Okay, she might be running a little bit late, so we'll recognize her when she comes in. Of course, our fearless leader, Chancellor Nancy Cantor. Oliver Quinn, the chair of the Rutgers Newark Advisory Board. Do we have U.S. District Court Judge Esther Salas? I didn't see my dear friend Judge Salas here. But we have some other judges. Judge Alan Kobitz. Thank you for coming. Siobhan Tier, Judge, thank you for coming. Did I mispronounce it? Oh, right here. Thank you. Judge Verna Leith Young. Thank you, Judge, for coming. And I'm meeting some of you for the first time, and I look forward to the reception where we can mingle afterwards. Judge Thomas Summers. It's nice to see you again. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. The first speaker, Del Del Cruz. Yes, thank you. Please, thank you. My apologies. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Judge. Anybody else? Judge McGee, thank you. Thank you for being here. Any other person here who could hold me in contempt? Please speak now. Most importantly, I want to recognize the students. Will all the students from Rutgers Newark please stand up? Come on, students. Thank you. Okay, our first speaker, and I gave him, we had a little chat before we got here, is the Oliver Quinn.
Well, we have the governor first.
Excuse me, Governor. Oh, my God, Governor, I am so sorry. Thank you for being here. Yes, of course. Governor Kane, thank you for being here at this very special event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all for coming. Impressive audience. Al would have been surprised and gratified by certainly the judges and the faculty and all of that. Most of all, if I remember him, by the students. He would have been very happy that you came tonight. He was an extraordinary person. I was looking around how many people here have very white hair. Yeah, because I was thinking whether any of the rest of you even know what a public advocate is, or was, because it doesn't exist anymore. The public advocate was a wonderful member of the governor's cabinet, created by Governor Brendan Byrne, and it was with the idea that, with all the important positions you have in government, there should be somebody advocating for the public. Advocating for those who had no other advocate. And it was created almost unanimously by the legislature, which I sat in under Brendan Byrne. And it was an interesting position because you had total free range. You could look for those who were unrepresented. You could look for people who were in prison. You could look for people, whoever it was, who most needed justice and most needed representation. That was what the public advocate was created to represent. Really a wonderful position, but controversial. In most administration, in Brendan's anyway, nobody liked the public advocate. For one reason, the public advocate sued a lot of people. I remember sitting in cabinet meetings and seeing Al Slocum sitting next to somebody who ran human services who he had 3 lawsuits against. And so, your fellow cabinet members get a little nervous when you're suing him. But Al was such a remarkable person. Those of you who know him know this. He had this wonderful sense of humor. If you knew him, you had to like him. He would do what was right, and he'd do it with vigor, and he'd do it with integrity, and he'd do it as hard as he could. But he did it fairly, he did it right, and nobody could ever really get mad at him. And he had respect all over the place. I mean, I was a Republican governor with a Democratic legislature, and so we occasionally had a few problems with confirmations and so on. Never big ones, but some. I remember I nominated Al Slocum, and he went to the Senate for confirmation. And about half an hour later, he was back. And I said, Al, did I put it off? He said, no, it's over. And one of the senators told me afterwards, the Democratic senator said to me, we confirmed him right away. And I said, well, that's very nice. I wish you'd do all of them that way. And I said, why? And he said, well, I don't know the man. But I know I was reasonably close to the African-American community in those days. I was Man of the year before for the NAACP. As a Republican, I'd gotten 60% of the African-American vote. I carried Newark and Camden and Jersey. So I was fairly close to the African-American community. And the senator said to me, we know you've got a lot of friends in that area. And this guy comes in, and he's got a bald head, and he's got a little goatee, and he looked at me like this, and I thought, we're going to confirm him right away. But he was such a wonderful influence. By the way, when I left office, a future governor abolished the position. People didn't like it, and when they could, they abolished it. But Al did it well. We had some good public advocates. Al was probably the best in many, many ways, because he had this passion for justice and a passion for helping those who needed help the most, of seeking those people out and doing what he could. And I remember I shared a story with him once that I liked in that area of going back to the time just after the Civil War. And Julia Ward Howe was a wonderful woman at the time, abolitionist and all of that, approached Senator Sumner. And she was for an individual who needed help. And Senator Sumner looked at her and said, Julia, I don't think I have time anymore for individuals. And Julia looked at him and said, Senator, even God hasn't gotten that far. He had time for individuals. He had time for people. He cared terribly about people, about everybody, all the time. He was he brought people together. He believed, I think, that power and justice somehow had to go together. That if somebody was powerful, they had to be just. If somebody was just, they should be powerful. And that somehow the two things had to come together. That was a fundamental belief of Al's. He was such a pleasure to be with. He used to come on cabinet retreats, and he was always one of those popular people there. I mean, everybody else in my cabinet liked him. And we need him. Right now we need him. I mean, we really need him. Because, men and women are monuments in some cases when they stand out like Al did. When they believe in justice, they believe in the right things, and sort of people live by the burning souls that they have and understand from them what human beings can be and ought to be. And we need people like that to stand up as examples today. And we don't have enough of them. But we remember Al. We remember Al, and we'll be better for remembering him in every way. There's a playwright I always loved called J. Barrie. And he said, God gave us memory that we might have roses in December. I feel better when I think about Al. And I think you do too. Thank you for having me.
Good evening. I'm Oliver Quinn. I'm chair of the Rutgers University Newark Advisory Board. I'm also class of 75 of Rutgers Law School. Proudly former director of the Minority Student Program, and a couple of other jobs along the way. And I am honored to be here to talk about Al Slocum, and talk a little bit about what I learned from Professor Slocum. My relationship with Professor Slocum emerged from, or evolved from, him being my professor, which was interesting, to him being my mentor. For a while, he was my boss. When he was a public advocate, I was his chief of staff, and most importantly, my friend. Al Slocum was a very complex man. He was funny, but he was intimidating. He was supportive, but he was provocative. He liked to argue. If you didn't argue with him, he would make you argue with him. He was confident. Some would say self-centered. Al liked Al. I liked Al a lot. But he was selfless. Al Slocum taught me not just the law, but he also taught me how to be a lawyer and an advocate for social justice. Al Slocum was a hard man to get to know, because you only got to know what he wanted you to know. But as you got to know him, as he let you in, as you were exposed to him, as you experienced him, you developed tremendous respect and affection and appreciation. He taught me to set a very high standard for myself, that preparation was the key to success. He taught me that there were no shortcuts, that you had to work hard in order to get everything you could out of every situation or opportunity. In school, he encouraged me to take the hardest courses with the hardest professors. That meant take his courses, not his professors. At work, he encouraged me to take on the most difficult assignments, to not shy away from them. Al Slocum was not passive at anything, at least in my experience. He taught me to be assertive and confident. He told me that whoever frames the question wins the argument, so don't wait for somebody else to frame it. Grab it and run with it. He used to tell me that I had to always be prepared to, his language, rap, meaning that anytime I had an opportunity to be in front of a group, to be at a microphone, that I had to be prepared to say something and say something worthwhile, that those were not opportunities that I could afford to squander. He was not passive at play either. We used to go up to Branch Brook Park when I was a student. He was a faculty member. We'd go up to Branch Brook Park to play touch football. It was supposed to be touch football. Professor Slocum would look for the biggest guy on the other team, and that's who he wanted to line up against. And inevitably, that person was on their behind in touch football. We would play tennis sometimes, and I'd just be wanting to take a light hit some balls back and forth. We'd hit about 3 balls, and he's ready to start keeping score and drilling me with this ball, hitting it right at me every time. And laughing. That was Al Slocum. He was not passive at all. Substantively, Al Slocum was uncompromising on matters of principle. One example, again, when we were at the Public Advocate, one of our divisions was the Division of Rate Counsel. Rate Counsel represents ratepayers in proceedings involving regulated entities that are trying to get their rates increased. And no matter what the consultants came up with, no matter what the justification for the rate increase, Public Advocate Slocum would not allow us to settle a case. He believed that his role was to represent the ratepayers and that the only way ratepayers should pay more is if a judge ordered that. So he would make us go to hearings on cases that we really didn't have a case. But that didn't matter to Al. Al believed that we still had to go in and fight for the ratepayer, and he was not willing to compromise one penny of the ratepayers' money. He was also what I would call a pragmatic strategist. He was a scholar, but he was an engaged scholar. He applied his scholarship to real-world situations. I came to work at the law school immediately after the Bakke decision, which was an affirmative action in higher education decision. And there was a big divide within the law school as to the impact of the Bakke decision on the minority student program. There were some who believed that it required that we end the minority student program, and then there were others who believed that it was not that hard and fast. And so we engaged in an amazing process at the law school with faculty, students participated, and alumni. And Al Slocum is the person who led the formulation of a restructuring of the minority student program that made it legally sustainable, but also allowed it to continue to achieve its goals of diversifying the bar. He did not dig in his heels. He did dig in his heels, but then strategically, he recognized when it was time to back off of that and fashion a compromise, and he did. And again, he framed the issue, and he won the argument. Al Slocum was challenging to deal with. I first met Al when I was a senior at Syracuse University, and I came down to Newark for an interview. And he was running the minority student program at that time. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had an appointment at 3 o'clock. And so I was here at 3 o'clock, and he wasn't. And 3:30, 4:30, no Al Slocum, no Professor Slocum. I didn't know him at that time. So I went back to Brooklyn where my parents lived, and I called, and he answered the phone. And I said, Professor, I'm Oliver Quinn. I had a 3 o'clock appointment with you. And his response was, yeah. I said, well, I was there and you weren't. And he said, well, you can come tomorrow morning. I said, well, are you going to be there tomorrow morning? And he said, Mr. Quinn, you pay your money and you take your chance. And so I came, I took my chance, I came, he was here, he interviewed me and he wound up admitting me, but it wasn't an auspicious start to our relationship. He also didn't believe in giving people compliments for doing what they were supposed to do. So if you did a good job, if you survived his grilling in class, which I did once, I took him for a class, Trust in Estates. There was another professor who was supposed to be teaching the class. That professor got sick, and the dean assigned Professor Slocum to teach the class. And it was this whooshing sound as 3/4 of the class ran to the registrar's office to drop an ad. I stayed in the class, and so the class met on Mondays and Wednesdays, and on a particular Monday afternoon, he pulled me aside as I was leaving, and he said, Mr. Quinn, you're on Wednesday. I said, I'm not a first-year student. I'm not going to be intimidated by you. I spent the next 48 hours in my apartment with my Trust in Estates book. Came to class that Wednesday, and he starts the class, he strokes his beard, Mr. Quinn. And for about 35 minutes, he was the ultimate analytical thinker. No matter what answer you gave, there was another question that he could come up with. And he would do that until either you got tired or he got bored. At the end of it, I thought I had knocked it out of the park. And he just moved on to the next student. Everybody else in the class is happy to see this because they know they're off for this, half hour, 35 minutes. So you're not getting any help from anybody. But he told me later on that I earned his respect. And I said, well, why didn't you, give a brother some dap? I mean, say, nice job or something. And he said, why should I compliment you for doing what you were supposed to do? Lesson learned. So to summarize, Al Slocum, to me, is the personification of this law school. He was highly intelligent, an analytical thinker, a very skilled teacher. He was dedicated to excellence, and he was dedicated to making the world a better place. Al Slocum, to me, is in the pantheon of engaged scholars who have served on the faculty of this school. The Arthur Kanois, Alan Axelrod, Frank Askin, Anna Mae Shepard, Willard Heckel, Paul Trachtenberg. Al Slocum is right there with them. And this school, to me, is Al Slocum's legacy. And we owe it to him to do him proud as we carry this school forward. Thank you.
Good evening. No, we could do better than that. Good evening. Okay, and I'm not the teacher. To Adele and the family, I just want to say thank you for allowing us this opportunity to talk about Al and our love for him. I think that Oliver, Wade Henderson, Janice Robinson, and myself were probably the students and the MSP directors who were most closest to Al. And Oliver, of course, is writing a book called My Life with Al Slocum. I'm going to try to, talk, because Oliver and I share stories about Al, and everything that he said, I know very much about Al, but I want to try to stay sort of in the contours. I can honestly say that my relationship with the law school and began and ended somewhere with Al Slocum in the middle of it all. Al admitted me to this law school, and it was unorthodox because he called me up one day in August and said, look, I have a seat here. Can you get here on August 18th? If you can get here, you're in. That was it. There was no interview. There was no, nothing formal, just come. He mentored me as a student in ways to make sure that we would understand that what we did as students had a great deal of effect on the longevity of the MSP program. And there's some people in this room who know what that meant in terms of the smack on the head or the... He challenged me as president of ABLS, especially to guard against the isolation inherent in racialized politics. And the year I graduated, it was the year I was a student speaker, and Al was also the faculty speaker, and we used to joke that we were the Angela Davis, Malcolm X combo. And when I returned to run the MSP program, Al was always available for a strategy huddle, and I would say that Al was my muse, but unlike Oliver, I never took a class from Al because I knew the beatdown that he gave students. And when I told him that I was going to take his class, he would sit there. He stood there and he was going like, yeah, I understand, Marcia. But beyond these perspectives, Al would be, if he were here, I think, a stalwart advocate of what the call that we have as a university and that our Chancellor, Nancy Cantor, has titled Protective Justice and Opportunity Building. To many of us, Al, as Oliver has said, is a forerunner of the vision we now have as an anchor institution, that we are the leaders that we have been looking for, and it is our responsibility to lay the groundwork for inequality to be supplanted by a new paradigm, even a new language. of inclusion and equitable development. Because after all, it was the People's Electric Law School, through its clinics, who performed feats of legal mastery that altered the lives of oppressed people, who actually began to engage in what is now called publicly engaged scholarship. And there was no program that embodied the principle of building bridges to equity and democracy better than the MSP, which Al, even as a student, had a playbook of strategies for its creation, its implementation, and certainly its survival. Al clearly saw the paradox of so many talented youth in our communities living inside an architecture of segregation and poverty. And he saw the potential of MSP to dismantle the lack of opportunity structure that so often was rooted in race, sex, gender, and income. MSP itself was the counter-narrative. He made it clear that a war of values was going on, and it took the right mastery of talent to be assembled to lead it. A diverse set of leaders for a diverse and complex nation. And while he was opening doors of opportunity, I have never forgotten 3 lessons, Al Slocum style, that demonstrate his deeply heartfelt commitment to genuine social change. Number 1, you must show up and show out to engage. Authentic struggle requires presence and ideas, and Al was intolerant of strident talk for its own sake. For if we are serious about fulfilling mandates of change, we must not just be around the table, we sometimes must create the table. Second, if you're going to talk, say something meaningful. You must have a credible narrative about the value of the remedies you seek, and you better be able to communicate effectively about the work that needed to be done, or risk the loss of your appeal. Third, be prepared to change your strategy when under attack or when it's ineffective. And Oliver spoke about that in relationship to the MSP. But Al was one of the few who was thinking innovatively and imaginatively about what to do when the forces of anti-affirmative action pounced upon the MSP program. And some of us wanted to stand and say, let's go to the Supreme Court and take our losses. And Al was like, I'm not about romantic losses, I'm about strategic victory. We upstairs and across this university under the leadership of Nancy Cantor are carefully practicing the lessons that we've learned from Al Slocum. As we work with the mayor and a diverse group of Newark residents on collaborative tables, which in great part rely on the scholarship of faculty from the law school and from other schools and units throughout the university. Because these are the people who are the producers of the knowledge that's needed to transform life in this city and in this state and in this nation as we know it to be. Under Nancy Cantor's leadership, we are engaged in what I call an Al Slocum type strategy to ensure that we continue this tradition birthed in the law school, born out of a sense of accountability for what? For the privilege that being a lawyer brings of bridging the divide between democracy and opportunity. Al never worried about whether it was easy or not. And as we face an uncertain future from DC, and Al would likely contest any view that any real leadership could come from DC, the more important question he would raise beyond who will lead is where will they lead us? And he would agree that now as then, we need committed minds, courageous hearts and souls to inspire us to become the voices and the architects for what the nation must become in the days and years to come. So here's to you, Al, and the genuine spirit of democracy that you left us. I miss you.
Good evening. First, I want to extend a warm greeting, a welcome home to the Slocum family, Adele, Alexander, Elisa, other members of the extended Slocum family. I see the Cottinghams are here and others. Good evening, Governor Kane, Rutgers Chancellor Cantor. I think I saw Executive, did I say Sherry Ann Butterfield here? We just saw Sister Vice Chancellor and Sister Marcia Brown. Law School co-deans, Dean Lopez and Dean Mutcherson, honored guest, Rutgers family. Thanks for coming out this really warm evening, right? My name is Charles Orfont. I'm a clinical professor of law here at the law school. And more importantly, and thanks to Professor Slocum and others, I'm a proud 1982 MSP graduate. We're here today to honor the memory, the legacy of Al Slocum, one of the great leaders, a pillar of our law school. Professor Slocum, like all great leaders, gave a significant part of his lifetime to this law school, to the struggle for MSP and its students, the struggle for racial justice. And we took that time from his family. I want to thank the Slocum family for sharing him with us. Thank you. Al was a proud family man who, like all proud dads, bragged about his family, especially his children. He loved his family dearly. They were his heart. And if you were lucky enough to have a close relationship with him, he let you know that. If Professor Slocum was here, he'd kind of lean back, grab his chin hairs, suck air through his teeth like he did, say, all right, Orfont, it's showtime. What are you going to bring to the table? Well, I, like everyone else in this room, am woefully inadequate to convey the importance of Al Slocum to this school, to the legal academy, to the city of Newark, this county, the state, to the struggle for civil rights. But it's showtime, so my introduction to Professor Slocum came in the summer of 1979. I was admitted to Rutgers Law School and to the Council on Legal Education Opportunity, CLEO, their summer institute. It was being held at Rutgers that summer, and it was a great thing for me because it gave me a stipend. And as was true then and as is true now, all MSP students need those 2 pennies. CLEO later, or had already become a part of Al Slocum's Rutgers conspiracy. CLEO is a national organization dedicated to opening the doors of law schools throughout the U.S. to people of color who were historically excluded from law school. Well after the establishment of MSP, Slocum took the helm of that organization, and after he left, he made sure his troops, as he would call us, maintained control and thereby continued the positive mission of CLEO, the Rutgers conspiracy. Now, I have to ask your forgiveness because I have to go on a brief tangent. And because I almost did not get to meet Professor Slocum that summer of 1979. You see, Professor Slocum also struggled to ensure that MSP was run by administrators who shared his vision, his troops. Well, I almost didn't get to meet him because, you see, I had to have this surgery. I had to have this tumor removed from my ankle, and I struggled with the hospital and the doctor to get the surgery moved up. You can imagine how that goes. Well, the best I could do would have me recuperating the first several days of the beginning of the CLEO term. I figured, that's reasonable. I'm having surgery. So I called the director of the Rutgers CLEO site to let them know I was recovering would be a few days late. The site director happened to be a person who I later find out was my MSP dean, Oliver Quinn. I called from my hospital bed right after the surgery. I told him I just had this operation and I'm recovering. I'd missed the first couple of days, and Dean Quinn, in true Slocum fashion, said, well, Mr. Orfont, he has that deathly serious low voice. Well, Mr. Orfont, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to participate in the program. I may have to call, I'm going to have to call Washington, D.C. in the morning if you're not here. Panic. So I hobbled, I had him tape me up, signed myself out of the hospital, got someone to drive me from the Bronx to Newark so I could keep those 2 pennies, that stipend. Welcome to a life in the law. Thank you, my Dean, Oliver Quinn. So I'm in CLEO. I'm this young Puerto Rican activist from the projects in the Bronx, and I'm sitting in this classroom, and this black man comes in speaking this new language, and he's having us read and decipher cases from the King's Bench and the Queen's Bench, and he is demanding. He demanded excellence from all of his students, but he was a great and giving educator. His review sessions for his first-year property classes are legendary. Luckily, I was not one of those students. He would take them to his home for a pre-final review session. He taught them for several hours. He answered all their questions. He fed them. This wasn't just a review session. This was an introductory lesson into the Rutgers law family. And now that I mention his home, forgive me, but I have to go on another brief tangent. I was invited to Casa Slocum on several occasions. Often, he'd wrangle me into just giving him a ride home. He lived on the top of this hill, and please I don't want to channel Marco Rubio, but he lived on the top of this hill. Of course, no one thought you could build on the top of this hill. But, the engineer in him came out. He told them exactly where to do the perk test. It passed, and now he lives on this mountaintop. And he refused, I believe, I'm not sure why, but for quite a long time, he refused to pave that mountain road up to the top of his house. It was up a mountain and then up higher, and it was a dirt road. It was 2 tire tracks. And I'm driving this Volkswagen. Yeah, it was, back then. And if there was snow and ice on that dirt road and you got stuck, you'd begin to slide back down to the bottom of that hill where there was a forest. It looked like a forest to me. I was from the Bronx. It was a clump of trees. And that's not a good thing. But Slocum taught me, he said, as soon as you get off the main road, you got to gun it and you'll make it up there. Okay. I got pretty good at it, So I'm a student, and I'm invited to Casa Slocum for some event, and it's a big deal, I think, this professor's house. And I tell my wife, I was married at the time, I tell my wife, listen, we got to get off this road. Don't be afraid. I got to gun it up there, and because if we don't gun it, we'll be in trouble. I turn off the dirt road. I gun the VW, and all of a sudden, there's a car in front of me, stuck on the road. And now I'm screwed. This car's not moving. I start sliding back into the mini forest behind me. I'm freaking out. I'm going to smash into a tree. Luckily, I stopped just before the trees, but I'm pissed now, right? I'm pissed, and I'm pissed at this son of a seahorse who stopped in front of me. This motherless, I don't know who it is. I didn't care who it was. I walked up to that car and I blurted out, "Hey, Police Director Williams, good evening, sir. Looks like we're both having some trouble getting up the hill." Al brought the Rutgers law family together, the powerful and seemingly powerless, MSP students, the Rutgers conspiracy. Al grew up running the streets of Newark. He was harassed by the local police forces. He was an EO guy, but he liked to say he ran the streets of Newark. He was harassed by the local police forces and told that he would never amount to anything by local educators. Sound familiar? He knew who we were because he was us. He knew where we came from because he came from the same place. He shared our invisibility. Ralph Ellison described it in Al's favorite novel, The Invisible Man, a favorite that I and many of us shared with him. I'm sure at a point in his life, like all people of color, he struggled with identity. Ellison wrote about it. Let me quote from The Invisible Man. "You often doubt if you really exist. You wonder whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds, say a figure in a nightmare, which the sleeper tries with all his strength to destroy. It's when you feel like this that out of resentment you begin to bump people back. And let me confess, you feel that way most of the time. You ache with the need to convince yourself that you do exist in the real world." and you strike out with your fists, you curse and you swear to make them recognize you. And alas, it's seldom successful. Al suffered through the Newark Rebellion of 1967. He knew the discrimination faced every day by people of color in this city and in this country because he was one of them. He heard the people's demands, their cry for justice. They were his demands, his cries, our cries. And that's why he engaged in the struggle that resulted in the creation of our MSP. No, you can't talk about Al Slocum without talking about race. Al Slocum was exposed to the teachings of Marcus Garvey early in his life by his family, but he wasn't a black nationalist. He was an internationalist. He loved people of color, the Bloods, as he called us. His family taught him that race was not always relegated to skin color. It was political. It's fitting that we come together the same week that we honor Dr. King's legacy to honor Alfred Slocum's legacy. Professor Slocum was a warrior, a civil rights warrior, a warrior against white supremacy. That's what he fought with the other students when he demanded the creation of the minority student program here at Rutgers. He continued that fight as a member of the faculty, protecting MSP. He spent his career in the legal academy, struggling against discrimination and the exclusion of people of color from the legal academy and the legal profession. The diversity of the academy and the profession is a product of his struggle. Dr. King said he wanted to be remembered as a drum major for justice. I see Al Slocum as a guerrilla warrior for justice. He was able to move seamlessly among widely disparate socioeconomic groups, among the powerful and the powerless. He could sit in the faculty meeting or the governor's cabinet, but then could hang out with MSP students or his friends on South 18th Street here in Newark, all natural to him. He dedicated his life to the struggle for racial justice, and he did so with a warrior's ferocity. He brought that ferocity to his classroom and was even more demanding with MSP students of color, because he knew we would be forced to overcome additional barriers. And he expected us to be troops in the struggle for justice. But the demands he placed on us were born of love for his people, the Bloods, as he would say. He always gave. He would always mentor and father students of color. Jose Ramos wrote this on Al's memorial wall. I am a combat vet and live abroad in Belgium. Professor Alfred Slocum helped me with food and money to pay my rent and kept me afloat until a family member could come get me at Rutgers. If not for this generous man, I would be homeless. He never asked for a dime back, and I never got a chance to give him thanks and a hug. To Alfred's family, he was an amazing professor and friend. He treated me like a son. It is because of him I went on to become a military aviator. Many of us have similar stories. Al was an architect of the Rutgers conspiracy. I mentioned it earlier. As an activist from the Bronx, I came to Rutgers thinking there were limited ways to serve the people, to bring about change through a life in the law. PD's office, legal services, community organizing. Al made sure that we were everywhere, that the Rutgers conspiracy reached every level of government and the corporate boardroom, that fair-minded Rutgers law grads committed to doing justice, to growing justice, became judges, politicians, and attorneys everywhere. And the Rutgers conspiracy was, well, always conspiring. Now, he wouldn't approve me of outing a conspiracy and may come back to punish me, but one of his Rutgers conspiracy game plans that both perplexed and fascinated me was work he did with Hubert Williams and others to reform policing. Then as now, police brutality in communities of color was a significant problem. Al worked with Hubert to identify and encourage police officers of colors who were good candidates to apply to law school, especially here. Once they graduated, they became a new type of police officer, one with a law degree. And back then, few police officers had advanced degrees. As police officers with JDs, they had unquestionable credentials and became some of the most highly qualified candidates to lead police departments. Many of them did. In that way, Al Slocum's and the Rutgers conspiracy struggled against police abuses in communities of color. That's just one example of the Rutgers conspiracy. Al Slocum was an unapologetic, unwavering, steadfast civil rights warrior. He opposed white supremacy, fought against it all his life. He kicked in the door of the legal academy and made sure that people of color, not only what some might describe as privileged people of color, but people of color from the underclass who were barred from this institution, he made sure we were given an opportunity. After he kicked that door open, he stood by it and made sure it stayed open because he knew, as my colleague, Robert Holmes, teaches our students, that the moment you're victorious in your struggle, the opposition is meeting to plan how they will undo the gains you've won. His work here raised an army, and now white supremacists are emboldened. They march with Nazis. They kill us in our places of worship, in our streets. The struggle is not new to people of color and fair-minded, progressive people. The ancestors lived through this and raised above even worse. And we, the troops, the army he raised, must rededicate ourselves to the struggle, and like Professor Slocum, we should do it steadfastly and unapologetically with fervor and fierceness. Frederick Douglass taught us, it is not the light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. The Rutgers conspiracy lives. We're all conspirators. Slocum vive, la lucha sigue. Thank you.
I'm really honored to be here and to be able to speak about Al Slocum. I want to thank Al's family for sharing him with Rutgers Law School for the many years that he taught here. I'm going to be brief in my remarks. Al Slocum was what I would describe as being in that first wave of black law professors. He wasn't the first black law professor at Rutgers Law School, but when I began teaching at Rutgers Law School in 1984, Al was one of the few black law professors teaching in a majority white law school in America. At that time, there was maybe one black law professor at this school and one at that school and maybe two at some other school, but black law professors were a rarity. And Rutgers actually was one of the few law schools that actually had 3 black law professors. There were 3 black law professors here when I came here in 1984, Al Slocum, Charles Jones, and Jerome Culp. I'm happy to say today that the situation is different in law schools. The faculties are much more diverse, and it's not such a rarity for a student to be taught by a black professor or a other professor of color. So it's a different world today, not a perfect one, but a different one. I sort of think of myself as being in the second wave of black law professors. In the 1980s, late 80s, in the 1990s, we still were not in big numbers, but there were many more than when Al began teaching. And I'm not saying that life for the people who started teaching in law school in the late 80s and 90s was a piece of cake, but it certainly was not, we did not confront the same challenges as people who were in that very first wave that Al Slocum was in. And while Al has been described here as someone who had, tremendous courage, tremendous confidence, I think it's important for us not to underestimate the stress that was on those individuals who were, the first, among the few, and who had to really be instrumental in fighting the battles that opened up the doors to people for the future. And we shouldn't underestimate the burden that was and what that took from their families in terms of time and in terms of energy that could have been devoted to the family that was consumed by these other struggles to move the world forward. So I just want to acknowledge that. Now, I had heard about Al Slocum when I was applying for law teaching jobs. I heard that he was a big presence at Rutgers Law School and that he was a powerful advocate for black people and other people of color, and that he was a passionate advocate of opening up the opportunities for people to receive an education in law school who really did not have that opportunity in earlier times. I also heard that he was a terror in the classroom. But I also was told that he was someone who would be a tremendous source of support and encouragement and advice for me when I joined the faculty here. So when I did join the faculty here, Al, Chuck, and Jerome were all just absolutely wonderful to me. And Al offered wonderful, wonderful insights. He sometimes told hilarious war stories about various faculty skirmishes as well as big battles in the law school. And, Al could really tell a story. I mean, he could really, give it the flavor that made it both insightful and entertaining. And he always offered whatever support I needed as a new faculty member in the law school. And, there were many very supportive people at the law school, faculty members who have been mentioned by previous speakers. And it is true that when I would talk to some of my colleagues at other law schools, they actually confronted a lot of things that I fortunately did not have to. And I attribute quite a bit of that to Al's presence in the law school and the tone that he set in this law school, which made it, I think, a much more respectful place than I think some other schools were, who did not have an Al Slocum, on their faculty. But the school did have its challenges in terms of issues of race and issues of diversity. After all, this is still America. But Al Slocum, he was always there, no matter what the issue was that had to do with the interests of minority students, the MSP program, the hiring of minority faculty, anything that had to do with issues of opening up opportunity and issues that have to do with just dignity, how people were treated in this law school. He was always there, and he made sure that there was an environment of respect when issues of race were talked about. I mean, I think there were certain things that just would not be said in the presence of Al Slocum. And I can tell you that in the early years of the law school, when there would be minority faculty candidates, sometimes the conversation, there was a real danger of it veering into comments that would be very comments you really wouldn't want to hear. But it never went as far as I was sure it would have if it wasn't for the presence of Al Slocum in that room. And so the other thing I want to just say is that, and that he was involved in anything that had to do with MSP, totally powerful, staunch advocate. And I think, the continuation of that program is, to a large extent, part of his legacy in this law school. I also want to say that the gift that he really gave to me personally was that because he really was such a huge presence in the law school, I was able to, in my pre-tenure years, when I was living in New York, and I still do, and I was a single mother raising my son, who's now grown, the fact that he was such a big presence in the law school, and that he spent so much time working on the issues that made this law school the way the law school that it is, and the big role that he played in fighting any battles that needed to be fought, actually made some space for me, you know, to be able to do the things I needed to do in order for me to continue to be present in this law school. And while I certainly and never have been silent on issues that have come up in the law school, but some of the time and the emotional energy that it takes to be in these struggles, for me, during especially my pre-tenure years, that was really lessened by the powerful and effective presence of Al Slocum on the faculty. And I want all of you to know, and especially for his family to know, and I have told them this individually, how grateful I really am for the way in which his presence and his advocacy here and his creation of an environment that was supportive for minority faculty, you know, how that made, it created the space for me so that I could be in the next generation of law professors to continue the struggles that he, was so active in. Now, when Al announced that he was retiring, I sort of felt like, oh boy. Because one of the things that I knew, and like I say, it's not that I've been a silent person at all in this law school, but I knew that that meant that I was going to have to take on an even larger role when he left with respect to all of the issues that, he fought for and that, I've been working for too. So let me just say in closing that, Al was really a model of the Black professional of his generation who, standing on the shoulders of those who came before him, opened doors for himself and was deeply committed to seeing that those doors stayed open for others who would come behind him. And I hope that the example that he set, the model that he set for others, is one that law professors, Black law professors, professors of color, and all professors who are interested in issues of opportunity, equality, and dignity will follow in the future.
Good evening. I'm Paige Cottingham Streeter, and I'm listed as niece. It's the simple title. They probably could have put a lot of other things there, like Alfred Slocum's best fan. But I decided to keep it simple because that's what he would do. I'm standing before you as a family member, but I also feel it's important to mention that I had the honor and the privilege to be taught by my uncle one summer as a Clio student before I went off to George Washington University Law School. So for those of you in the room that had him, I understand. And it actually was an experience that helped me understand the importance of his work. Growing up, we heard about our wonderful Uncle Alfred. He's a busy man. He's an important man. But I honestly didn't have the full appreciation and the extent of the work that he was doing and the army that he was building, as he would say, until I had the chance to be in a room like this. It was a different room. It was down the street. But it just waxes nostalgic for me. I wanted to say on behalf of not only myself, because the words I'm going to share with you are my own and my own reflections, but I represent the Slocum family. Those of you in the front row, I'm here, and you're my people, but there are others who are not here. And they wanted you all to know that Alfred Slocum was important to them in so many ways and left a legacy that's motivated them to do their best and to make sure that they provide the access and the opportunity that they've had that others may not. And my cousin Gail Hilliard is tonight actually at a board meeting for an organization that she and her siblings are participating in to make sure that students in the Trenton area have opportunity for higher education. So while this front row was filled, know that this entire room could be filled with other family members who have things to share and wonderful memories to share. I'm the last speaker. I recognize that. A lot's been said. We've established and we know that Alfred Slocum was an accomplished engineer, a legal scholar, an advocate for justice, public servant, and educator, and we could probably even list more. But he was also a family man, and his family was extensive. In addition to those of us who are related to him by blood or marriage, Uncle Alfred's extended family included beloved Church of the Epiphany family members and others whose lives he touched. I realized this a couple of years ago when Uncle Alfred stepped up to the podium to speak at an award ceremony my brother had asked him to attend. Uncle Alfred had flown out to California to make a presentation to the U.S. Fencing Association Hall of Fame award ceremony. He introduced himself with pride as Uncle Alfred. You see, he had become well known in the fencing world, not only as a fan of the sport, but as an advocate and supporter of black fencers, my brother included, when the system was not in their favor. Uncle Alfred grew up a black child in the 1930s and knew the pain and consequences of racism and discrimination firsthand. He witnessed the obstacles his parents and grandparents had to overcome in order to earn a decent living and maintain their household. And he experienced the frustration and disappointment exacted by segregation. Within the walls of the 3-story home at 62 Ashland Avenue in East Orange, where he was born and raised, Uncle Alfred was surrounded by the wisdom and protection of his parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all of whom occupied the same house. Beyond the front yard, it was another story. He and his siblings encountered what he described as the realities of life's vagaries and inequalities. Uncle Alfred often said, "Everything I needed to learn, I learned on Ashland Avenue." From his parents, he learned the value of hard work and education. They insisted that he and his siblings take the A-track classes designed for the talented white kids rather than the C-track courses that were reserved for colored students. Uncle Alfred's grandmother, Ma, a force to be reckoned with, in her own right showed him how to soldier up when the road is difficult and challenge authority. Family lore has it that Uncle Alfred was her favorite, and I suspect the feeling was mutual. She was certainly his staunchest advocate who came to his defense whenever any family member or school official lodged a complaint against him. On one occasion, young Alfred came home from school with a note in his pocket from the elementary school principal saying he had been suspended for insubordination. Mom met him at the door, turned him around, and together they went back to school where she insisted there must have been a misunderstanding and questioned whether the motivation for the discipline was race. Uncle Alfred carried on Ma's legacy and spent his life protecting and defending the rights not only of his own family, but his community. Ashland Avenue was also the place where Uncle Alfred faced off bullies and bigots and made lifelong friends. He loved to recount stories about the inhabitants of 6 and 2, as the family affectionately called the homestead, and the other families also on the block. Once, Uncle Alfred had an arsenal of stories. Anything could trigger his storytelling. Usually during family gatherings, a conversation among a small group of people would lead to one thing or another, and the size of the group would grow as Uncle Alfred's voice got louder and more animated, and others in the house realized that there was a story being told. We loved the performance, the pacing, the gestures, and the carefully chosen words. We hung on every word. His playlist was extensive, covering everything from family history and adolescent shenanigans to adventures during military service and family travel. One of the standards, and my favorite, is about the race. Uncle Alfred was a high hurdler and a member of the East Orange High School track team. The team had made it to the Essex County Track and Field Championships and he would be running the relay race with 3 other hurdlers, George Moore, Ralph Garcia, and my dad, Robert Cottingham. These guys were taller than Uncle Alfred with longer strides that only required that they take the customary 7 steps in between hurdles. Because of his stature, the team practiced with Uncle Alfred taking 8 steps in between the hurdles. This meant he needed to alternate his legs and the hurdles were 42 inches high. The night before the relay race, Uncle Alfred heard my dad concede to the Scott High School rivals, who were also childhood friends, that East Orange might medal but not win. Well, the next day the lineup would be George Moore, Ralph Garcia, Alfred Slocum, and Robert Cottingham anchoring. After Uncle Alfred took the baton, he easily cleared the first hurdle, then the second, then the third, taking only 7 steps in between. When he passed the baton to my dad, he was neck and neck with the hurdler from Scott High, and he said, "It's on you, Cot." Uncle Alfred told it, he said, if they lost, it wouldn't be on him. East Orange High School won the championships. As you can imagine in the storytelling, there was a lot of pacing, finger pointing, and ribbing. Uncle Alfred liked that story, and so did we. Like most stories, it illustrated a point. I believe Uncle Alfred ran that relay the way he led his life. Face the challenge, make no excuses, work hard, and keep the faith.
Wonderful. I want to thank all the speakers for your beautiful, heartfelt, passionate memories of Professor Al Slocum, and really a reminder to all of us about his role and his contributions to what this institution stands for. I want to recognize our faculty members. We do have some faculty members here, so will all the faculty members and staff members please stand up? Thank you for carrying on the legacy. I direct this to the students. I hope that you understand that this is who we are. This is what makes this institution very special and very important at this moment in time. We heard some beautiful comments from Mr. Quinn, from Ms. Brown, about their time at the MSP program and about Professor Slocum's fundamentally central role in creating a climate and a normalization of opportunity at this law school. We have other folks who were not able to attend tonight, but I want to bring our current MSP director, Yvette Bravo-Weber, to read some of these comments. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Yvette Bravo-Weber. I'm the Dean of the Minority Student Program here at the Rutgers location. We have the director of the MSP program, Rashida Douglas, is here as well tonight. Before I read the comments, I wanted to say something about my starting working as when I was a kid, my parents used to use a lot of idiomatic expressions in Spanish. They rhyme beautifully in Spanish. But I found out subsequently that some of them were not common idiomatic expressions. It was things that they made up, that they felt they could use as lessons for my brother and I. So one that we heard all the time was, remember where you came from, recognize where you are, and dream about where you're going. And I asked my mother years later, where'd you get this? She goes, I thought it sounded good. Your father and I figured, So when I started as the Dean of MSP, that's what I wanted to bring to the program, that as a program, we had to remember where we came from, recognize where we are, and dream about where we're going. So part of that was to ask former MSP deans to come to talk about the history of the program. So every orientation, either Jan Robinson or Marsha Brown come and give us the history. What was fascinating to me as I started learning it was, what do you mean? A law student was involved in the forming of MSP? Really? What, but how could that be that it was a law student? And that was my first introduction to Al Slocum. And I was amazed that a law student had that kind of commitment and dedication. So a few years ago, the other thing that was really important to me was having the faculty that we have here who were in MSP as well, Ron Chen, Esther Canty-Barnes, and Charles O'Font, speak to the students at orientation. So a few years ago, I was talking to Charlie, and I said, Charlie, maybe, instead of just talking to them, maybe you can show them a legal film. That might be an interesting way for you to kind of make yourself known. And he thought about it, and he said, I got the film. It's a documentary on Arthur Kanoy. That's what we should show them, because Arthur Kanoy is one of the giants of Rutgers Law School. So I get a copy of the documentary, and lo and behold, Al Slocum is in the documentary because his mentor, one of his mentors, was Arthur Kanoy. So our students now get to see not only Arthur, but also hear from Al Slocum and the dedication that he had to the work he was doing with Arthur Kanoy. And two things that people haven't mentioned about him, the graciousness and eloquence with which he spoke is amazing. So I'm very grateful to Charlie that he brought not only Arthur, but Al Slocum to the current MSP students. Now I would like to read some comments that other people who could not be here have asked us to read. The first is from Professor Steve Gould, who's currently on our faculty, and he writes, I regret that an important personal engagement will keep me from attending this evening's remembrance of Al Slocum. Because I can't be there in person, I wanted to let you know that I will be there in spirit. Al was emeritus by the time I joined the faculty, but early in my career here, I was fortunate enough to hear him give some speeches and presentations, and occasionally to receive his advice. Listening to him, privately or in public, was an electric experience. When I tried to describe it to a friend, the adjectives that popped by free association into my mind were brilliant, fierce, gentle, eloquent, mesmerizing. Every encounter with Al made me aspire to reach his level, impossible a task as that might be. I miss him as I know you do too. The second is from a 95 alumni of the law school who was not in MSP. He says, greetings, my name is Rick Morris, and I graduated Rutgers Law in 95. I've been living in London for the last 7 years, so regrettably I can't be with you today to pay tribute to Professor Slocum, a man who has had such an impact on my development at Rutgers Law and beyond, despite us sharing so little in common politically. Professor Slocum did more to teach me to think like a lawyer than any other professor, which is incredible considering almost all of our substantive interaction occurred during only one semester when he taught me first-year property in my small section. You can't really think like a lawyer without abandoning your attachment to your pre-law school mode of thinking. And Professor Slocum was a wrecking ball when it came to tearing down that old, non-structured, non-legal way of thinking and arguing. To say Professor Slocum was intense is obviously an understatement. I learned that, and Oliver, you'll relate to this. I learned early that Professor Slocum had a tradition of inviting the entire small section to his home each year for a picnic and a game of touch football. By touch football, I mean, everybody but him was playing two-hand touch. The professor, on the other hand, brought the same fire and intensity evident in his classroom to the football field. I understood this immediately after being driven into the bushes by a violent open field tackle executed by a fully airborne, horizontal Professor Slocum defending his home turf. One time, my roommate, who sat next to me in property, was less than 100% prepared for class. Of course, that was the day he was called on to try to present a case study. Unable to respond to Professor Slocum's rapid-fire questions, he resorted to diving into his notebook, looking to buy some time to try to dig himself out of his hole. Professor Slocum, very calmly and gently, warned him he was going to come over the desk the next time my roommate dove into his notebook in search of answers. The admonition was not heeded, and the next thing I know, Professor Slocum launches himself on top of our shared desk, his imposing figure literally towering over us and hollering, "Eyes up here! There is no salvation in those notes. There is no salvation in those notes." The next 5 minutes, my roommate had to finish the case study with Professor Slocum standing on our desk, carpet bombing questions all over his victim, literally from above. I say this with no exaggeration. After that, I was less than 120% prepared for property class, exactly 0 times for the rest of the semester. But Professor Slocum didn't leave such an impact on me from his intensity alone. There was method to his madness. The intellectually violent confrontations in class, at least for me, helped accelerate my abandonment of my old ways of thinking and arguing. Gradually, over the course of the property class, we learned to separate the signal from the noise and to construct defensible arguments. You knew if you could develop arguments that would survive a few rounds with Professor Slocum and be focused and quick enough to keep him from climbing over your desk, you could debate anybody. The last thing I'd like to say about Professor Slocum is how focused he was in class in developing legal thinking. There was almost 0 distraction in his classroom. A lot of fear, to be sure, but no distraction. On a personal level, my politics could not have been more opposite of the professor's. I was one of the few members of the Federalist Society at that time, which group, unfortunately for me, had just published an op-ed piece characterizing Professor Slocum's role during his time as public advocate as lobbyist-in-chief for recreational carjackers. I was more than a little concerned about guilt by association, but I had nothing to fear. Professor Slocum was the most apolitical professor I had at Rutgers Law. Regardless of whether he felt a personal attachment to a political or policy argument being served up in class to mask the lack of legal argument, in that property class he had 0 patience for the political diversions. Social justice arguments to which Professor Slocum dedicated a good portion of his life defending were deprived of any oxygen in his property class, where the purpose was a bit less ambitious than changing the world. That one property class is in my first year small section, taught by a towering Professor Slocum, was the most intense, focused, impactful class I believe that I have ever taken in any context. That class did more to teach me to think like a lawyer than any other class I took, which is even more impressive in the context of the overall high quality of the professors at Rutgers Law. In some of my more challenging moments as a lawyer and later as an investor, I have drawn on those boot camp days with Professor Slocum for inspiration to realize that I got this. It was only with the distance of a few years after that experience that I came to realize how much love and dedication Professor Slocum poured into that class to keep it so focused, intense, and effective. And for that, I will be forever grateful to him, and I may even forgive him for the bruised ribs that one day. Okay, there's just two more short ones. This one is from someone who was in the first MSP class ever. His name is Albert Guillory. He was a state senator in Louisiana, now retired. He writes, "There I was, a colored boy from the segregated Deep South, in a strange new world. Failure was not an option. How to succeed was the only question. And there he was, Professor Slocum, barely older than I, but experienced and comfortable in this place where I must struggle. Professor Slocum counseled, advised, mentored, guided, gently suggested, and I will always appreciate his efforts and love and the love he gave me. To his family, thank you for sharing him with us. To Rutgers, thank you for having him as a rock in my strange new world. To Professor Slocum, my brother, I shall share one of your bewhiskered bear hugs sooner than later when I join you upstairs." And then finally, a few words from Professor Frank Askin, who is obviously Professor Slocum's partner in crime in really starting MSP. He writes, "I am sorry I cannot be with you today, but I am pleased to join this tribute to Al Slocum. Al entered law school in the fall of 1967 as an older second career student. He had previously been an engineer. He quickly became a force at the law school. When we implemented the minority student program in the fall of 1968, Al, as a second-year student, helped me administer the program for the first few years. After graduation, he joined the faculty and became a mentor to many young students and enjoyed a long career as a very popular professor. He surely left a mark on Rutgers Law School, Newark. And I celebrate him. Thank you, and if anyone else wants to come up to make remarks, please do so."